Have you ever wondered how a man could survive one of the deadliest wars in human history, return home without speaking about what he had seen, and then spend the rest of his life writing stories that made millions question fear, death, power, and human nature? Imagine it now. A humid night in the Pacific Ocean. The date is May 1945. The jungle is almost silent for a brief moment, but every soldier knows silence here is often more dangerous than gunfire. The air smells of wet earth, smoke, and burned trees. Somewhere in the darkness, machine guns begin firing again. Young American paratroopers dive for cover as mortar rounds explode around them. One of those soldiers presses himself into the muddy ground, gripping his rifle while trying to slow his breathing. He has no idea that decades later, the nightmares of this night will become some of the greatest television stories ever written. His name is Rod Serling. Long before audiences entered the Twilight Zone, Rod Serling had already lived inside one. Before he ever wore an army uniform, Rodman Edward Serling was simply a boy from Binghamton, New York. Born on December 25, 1924, he grew up fascinated by books, radio dramas, and storytelling. His father encouraged his imagination, while his mother filled the house with warmth despite difficult times. Friends remembered him as curious, energetic, and always asking questions. Stories fascinated him because they allowed ordinary people to face extraordinary situations. No one could have guessed that reality would soon become stranger than anything he could imagine. Everything changed after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Like thousands of young Americans, Serling watched his country rush toward war. He attended Antioch College for a short time, but soon decided his future would not be spent in classrooms. In 1943, at just 18 years old, he enlisted in the United States Army. Many young men chose safer assignments when they could. Rod Serling volunteered for the Airborne Forces. It was one of the most dangerous branches in the entire military. Airborne training demanded both physical strength and mental endurance. Soldiers learned to jump from aircraft carrying heavy equipment while trusting little more than fabric and rope to keep them alive. Every landing could mean broken bones or worse. The instructors pushed recruits beyond exhaustion because combat would demand even more. Serling accepted every challenge. Behind his quiet personality was a determination that surprised many around him. Soon he earned the coveted silver parachutist wings and became part of the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment, assigned to the 11th Airborne Division. Months later, that training carried him across the Pacific. By late 1944, American forces were fighting to liberate the Philippine Islands from Japanese occupation. The campaign was brutal. Thick jungles, steep mountains, tropical diseases, hidden bunkers, and determined defenders turned every advance into a deadly struggle. The young paratrooper who once dreamed of becoming a writer now spent his days carrying ammunition, digging fighting positions, and watching friends disappear one by one. Then came the night that would never truly end. The jungle offered almost no visibility. Rain had soaked the ground until every step disappeared into thick mud. The men moved carefully, speaking only when absolutely necessary. Every rustle in the trees forced fingers tighter around rifle triggers. Somewhere ahead, Japanese positions overlooked the trail. Nobody knew exactly where. Suddenly, the darkness exploded. Machine gun fire ripped through the trees. Tracer rounds cut glowing lines across the night. Mortars burst overhead, showering dirt, branches, and metal fragments onto the Americans below. Serling threw himself into cover as explosions shook the earth. You can almost feel the blast waves striking your chest before the sound fully reaches your ears. Training took over. Find cover. Stay low. Return fire only when you identify a target. Around him, medics crawled toward wounded soldiers while riflemen tried to locate hidden enemy positions. Time seemed to disappear. Minutes felt like hours. Every heartbeat became its own measure of survival. War quickly destroyed every illusion of glory. The enemy was often invisible. Hunger became normal. Sleep arrived only in short moments between danger. Soldiers carried fear with them every hour of every day, but they learned to keep moving anyway. Serling watched brave men disappear without warning. One conversation during breakfast could become a memory before sunset. That constant uncertainty would remain with him for the rest of his life. As the Philippine campaign continued into 1945, the 11th Airborne Division participated in daring operations that helped break Japanese resistance. They fought through difficult terrain and participated in missions that demanded speed, coordination, and relentless determination. Serling served as both a rifleman and later in other responsibilities as casualties reduced unit strength. Like countless infantrymen, he adapted to whatever the battlefield required. Then, fate intervened in the cruelest way imaginable. During one operation, an American supply crate released from an aircraft broke loose during the drop. Instead of landing safely in the designated area, the heavy crate slammed into Serling. The impact caused severe injuries, including broken bones and internal damage. It was a terrible accident, not enemy fire, that nearly ended his life. After surviving combat, an ordinary supply drop almost killed him. War often ignored logic. His injuries forced him out of frontline service. Recovery was painful and slow, but the emotional wounds reached even deeper than the physical ones. Before leaving combat, Serling had witnessed enough suffering to last several lifetimes. Friends had been lost. Young men full of dreams had vanished in seconds. Heroism existed, but so did fear, confusion, grief, and terrible randomness. The battlefield rarely rewarded the brave in fair ways. Sometimes courage survived. Sometimes luck decided everything. For his service, Rod Serling received the Purple Heart, the Bronze Star, and the Philippine Liberation Medal, among other decorations. Those medals represented sacrifice, but they never explained the memories carried home inside the minds of returning veterans. Metal could recognize courage. It could not erase trauma. When the war finally ended in 1945, millions celebrated victory. Families welcomed loved ones home with smiles, music, and relief. Yet many veterans returned carrying invisible burdens that few civilians understood. Rod Serling was one of them. Friends and relatives noticed changes. He could still laugh. He could still work. But the war had permanently altered the way he saw humanity. Unlike some veterans who openly shared battlefield stories, Serling spoke very little about combat. He rarely described specific experiences in detail. Silence became its own form of survival. Many veterans believed that the people back home could never truly understand what they had witnessed. Others simply wanted to protect their families from painful memories. Serling instead chose another path. He would tell the truth without appearing to tell it at all. After the war, he returned to Antioch College under the GI Bill. There, he studied literature and developed his skills as a writer. He also worked at a campus radio station, discovering that words spoken aloud carried enormous emotional power. Every script became an opportunity to explore questions that had haunted him since the Pacific. Why do ordinary people obey cruel systems? Why does prejudice survive after tragedy? Why can fear make decent people commit terrible acts? Those questions had no simple answers, but storytelling gave him a way to search for them. His talent quickly attracted attention. During the early 1950s, television was expanding rapidly across America. Networks needed talented writers capable of producing original dramas every week. Serling worked relentlessly, often writing late into the night. His scripts stood out because they focused less on action and more on human decisions under pressure. Viewers connected with his characters because they felt real. Even when extraordinary events occurred, the emotions remained painfully believable. Success arrived with acclaimed television dramas like Patterns and Requiem for a Heavyweight. Critics praised his ability to combine sharp dialogue with emotional depth. Yet Serling repeatedly encountered another obstacle. Television sponsors frequently objected to controversial subjects involving racism, war, political corruption, and abuse of power. Scripts were softened, endings changed, difficult truths disappeared before reaching audiences. Instead of giving up, Serling found an ingenious solution. If he could not openly criticize society, perhaps he could hide those criticisms inside science fiction, fantasy, and mystery. That idea became one of television history's greatest breakthroughs. On October 2, 1959, The Twilight Zone premiered. To many viewers, it looked like a series about aliens, time travel, strange towns, and impossible events. But beneath every unusual story lived something far more personal. Fear, moral choice, isolation, the abuse of authority, the randomness of death, the fragile line between civilization and chaos. These were not imaginary ideas. They had followed Rod Serling home from the Pacific. Watch many of the series closely, and the wartime influence becomes impossible to ignore. Soldiers appear repeatedly. Veterans struggle with memory. Ordinary citizens surrender freedom because of fear. Communities turn against innocent neighbors. Powerful leaders manipulate truth. Individuals are forced to make impossible moral decisions. The monsters are often not creatures from another world. They are human beings placed under extraordinary pressure. Serling once understood something that remains true today. The greatest horror rarely comes from the supernatural. It comes from ordinary people making terrible choices when frightened. He had witnessed that lesson firsthand during the war. His calm voice became one of television's most recognizable sounds. Week after week, he introduced stories that invited audiences into strange worlds. Yet behind every introduction stood a veteran who understood genuine fear better than most people ever would. The quiet confidence in his narration came from someone who had already stared into uncertainty long before cameras ever began rolling. Rod Serling never became famous because he fought in World War II. He became famous because he transformed the emotional truth of that experience into stories that anyone could understand. He proved that science fiction could explore history, psychology, prejudice, loneliness, and justice without ever sounding like a lecture. His battlefield had changed from tropical jungles to television screens, but his mission remained remarkably similar. He wanted people to think before fear controlled them. Years after the war, millions knew Rod Serling as the man who welcomed them into another dimension. Few realized that he himself had crossed a very real boundary years earlier, one that separated innocence from experience, certainty from doubt, and peace from memories that never completely faded. The humid jungle night eventually ended. The gunfire stopped. The smoke disappeared. The soldiers who survived boarded ships and airplanes back home. But for one quiet veteran, that night never truly finished. It echoed through every page he wrote, every question he asked, and every unforgettable ending he created. He rarely spoke about World War II because he no longer needed to. He had already spent the rest of his life telling the story in another way. Every unforgettable episode of The Twilight Zone carried a small piece of the young paratrooper who once lay awake in the darkness, listening for the next shot, wondering whether dawn would ever come. That is why Rod Serling did far more than create a legendary television series. He transformed the silence of war into stories that will continue reminding future generations that the strangest place we can ever enter is not another world. It is the human mind itself.